The verse of the day is Romans 1:21, and it says, "Yes, they knew God, but they wouldn't worship him as God or even give him thanks. And they began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. As a result, their minds became dark and confused." The title of today's portion of scripture is called God's Anger at Sin, and I believe paints a really clear picture of what happens when we don't actively pursue following Jesus on a day-to-day basis. It highlights what's possible for all of us. We've covered how all of us experience the same temptations. None of us are void of these temptations and these lies that the devil will feed us. And so this is why it's important that we feed our spirit every day. We armor up, we guard our heart, we renew our mind. Because when we allow wickedness to be our focus, and what's wickedness? Wickedness is doing anything that's outside of the boundary of how God calls us to live. When we entertain that and we allow that into our life, today's verse can happen. Our minds can become dark and twisted because we're more prone to believe lies, because we're opening the door to sin, because we're being led by our flesh and our feelings rather than faith and truth. I think a really powerful part of today's verse is, yes, they knew God, but they didn't worship him as God. What is worship? I think when we hear the word worship, it's easy to think music and singing and songs and what we do before the sermon at church. But worship is how you live your life. How you live your life is worshiping God or not. Our lives are honoring God or not. So our lifestyle is worship. And with today's verse, it highlights, okay, is my life honoring God? Is the way I live worship to God? Or do I just sometimes want to feel like I'm learning about God and doing the Sunday thing in worship with music? But does my life look like worship? Because if your life doesn't look like worship, you are prone to your mind becoming dark and confused and full of lies. And this is when the door to fear and anxiety and worry and pain and trauma is opened, because that's what happens when we disobey, when we fall away from God, when we don't actively pursue him. Makes me instantly think of my life. I knew God. I believed in him, but I didn't worship him with my life. My life looked nothing like him. My thoughts looked nothing like him. My desires looked nothing like him. But once I got to know him and I started to grow in relationship with him, my heart started to get all of the love it needed, which shifted my desires and how I lived my life. So my life, because I met Jesus, I wanted to turn from my way, follow his way, and my life has started to become more and more God-honoring the more I walk with him. And that's what happens. The more you walk with God, the more you get stronger in your understanding of him. And the more you start to understand this fight that we're in. Remember, this isn't a fight against humans. This is a fight against spiritual things, principalities, darkness. And when we remember all of these truths, it helps us suit up better. It helps us feed our spirit better. It helps us deny the lies better and protect our mind from becoming dark and twisted. I just love how plain today's verse is. They knew God, but they didn't worship him. And so their thoughts started to become dark and twisted and full of confusion. It reminds me of Adam and Eve. When the serpent fed Eve a lie, he said, "Did God really say this? Did God really say don't eat from this tree?" And she, for a minute, took her eyes off of what truth was, started listening to the serpent and his lies, entertaining his lies, and she became convinced and then disobeyed. And because of that, she then walked into shame and wanted to hide. So her mind became confused and dark. This is the order of what happens when we don't worship God with how we live our life. And when Adam and Eve ate from that tree, they weren't worshiping God. They were deciding to stand in the God spot for themselves. They knew God, they were walking with God, but they didn't honor him in that moment with their life. And so that opened the door to sin. And then because of it brought shame and fear into their mind. I think the way Adam and Eve actually didn't even go to God to discuss, okay, the serpent said that we won't really die. And so what do you think about this, to really get a more understanding? Instead of seeking God's understanding about what the serpent said, they followed their own. And what happened to Adam and Eve is an example of what happens when we rely on our understanding. And today's verse is as well. When we rely on our understanding apart from what God says, our thoughts get twisted. We become deceived. We get confused. We open the door to pain and heartache. I say all the time, God is not intimidated by your unbelief in him. He's not intimidated by your doubt or any of your questions. And so the safest thing that you and I can do is bring our doubt, bring our confusion, bring our questions to God, to the person of truth, so that he can speak into it, so that he can give us the right perspective and renew our mind, so that we can see things the way he does and protect ourselves from becoming more confused and walking in a direction that will just bring harm and disconnection with God. I think when we read a verse like today, it can be easy to think, okay, so I know God and I want to worship him, but what if I don't do it right? What if I'm failing and I'm falling short and I'm still struggling? That's okay. God doesn't need your perfection. He just needs your persistence in following him, because the devil will never stop persisting to get into your mind. And we get to embrace grace every day. God doesn't need our perfection. He uses actually those moments when we fall short to bring our greatest purpose and to understand who he is even more. And so with a verse like today, we get to see it as, okay, we know God and we get to worship him with our life. And in the parts of our life where we fall short and we're weak, it's not a lane to condemn or to shame, but instead to encourage for more dependence on God. Oh, that is where I get to depend on God more. Oh, that is where I get to understand who God is more, how he can meet my needs more. I also love how it says, and give him thanks. You guys, thanksgiving is such an important piece to the puzzle when it comes to following Jesus. I've read somewhere that you can't simultaneously be thinking about an anxious thought and being thankful. So a good way to renew your mind and not be conformed to the patterns of this world, to not be conformed by what the enemy is telling you by giving you a dart of fear or worry. Instead, look at the fear and worry and say, oh, how can I be thankful here? Okay, maybe I'm worried about doing something at work. God, thank you that I have a job. God, thank you that your power is made perfect in my weakness. So I get to actually depend on you at work with a thing that feels scary. And it's a blessing that I feel unqualified because you get to qualify me. You get to get all the glory. And then I don't have to maintain it, Lord, and it gets to be you shining. And then I get to testify to who you are to my workplace. I think today's verse is good to reflect on and think, okay, where am I not worshiping God with my life? Where does my lifestyle not honor God? Because that is going to be an open door to confusion in your mind. And that's where you can guard your heart more and be more obedient. So think about that and put it into practice, okay?